Hello guys, and welcome to this new episode, The Unexplainable. In the heart of the Church's history, unspeakable secrets are hidden. Popes who have lived in sin, deadly conspiracies, heresies, and scandals that have undermined their power. Dark events made of greed, lust, and betrayals that seem to belong more to a court of absolute kings than to the seat of the Vicar of Christ. Today I will take you to discover some of the most shocking scandals that have hit the papacy during the Middle Ages. We will talk about warrior popes, forbidden loves, accusations of heresy, and power struggles without any holds barred. Get ready, because what you are about to hear will leave you speechless. So here are the secrets of the most shocking popes in history. That seemed to belong to In the Middle Ages, the role of the Pope was not limited to being the spiritual guide of Christianity. He was also a figure of temporal power, a ruler with political ambitions, a heroic leader who commanded armies and established alliances with the main European dynasties. The Church, while intended as the channel through which the faithful approached God, was deeply intertwined with worldly affairs, governing vast territories and influencing the politics of the time. The popes were not only religious figures then, but also prominent characters on the international scene. They held enormous economic power thanks to their vast possessions, such as the territories of the Papal State, and an influence that went well beyond the borders of the Vatican. Their word was law, and they often found themselves mediating between European powers, toppling and raising kingdoms, waging wars and sealing alliances. And as it is known, with power sometimes comes corruption. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was not only the center of spirituality, but also a place of intrigue, scandals, and unchecked power. While the papal figure was supposed to be a symbol of purity and righteousness, some of the most famous popes in history have done everything possible to undermine that reputation, often overwhelmed by their own vices and desires. Here are those who have left a dark and indelible mark in the history of the institution. Pope John XII. The first pope I want to talk about is John XII, a pontiff, whose figure is linked to one of the most scandalous events in the history of the Church. Born in Rome around 930 with the name Ottaviano, he ascended to the papal throne at only 18 years old, thanks to the influence of the powerful Crescenti family and the Roman aristocracy. However, his papacy would not be remembered for acts of faith or wisdom, but for his moral and political decay, which deeply marked history. John XII distinguished himself for a dissolute life, far from the austerity and rectitude one would expect from a head of the Church. The accusations against him were numerous and included corruption, violence, and a scandalous conduct that shook the whole of Europe. The most serious crime he was accused of was simony, that is, the sale of ecclesiastical offices in exchange for money, an act that undermined the very foundations of the Christian faith. But John XII did not just tolerate this practice. He turned it into a real tool to consolidate his power and that of his allies, contributing to the commodification of the institution. Moreover, his private life left much to be desired. He was known for his licentious behavior, numerous lovers, and, above all, for much more serious accusations, such as having had incestuous relationships with his own sister and other women in his family, a fact that fueled indignation and scandal. Lust was not the only vice that marked his pontificate. John XII was also involved in political murders, eliminating anyone who threatened his rule over Rome and the Church. Violence and betrayal were tools he used without hesitation to maintain control. Even his allies accused him of reducing the papacy to a farce, a decadent kingdom devoid of any sanctity. His death, which occurred in 964, was the pinnacle of his disgrace. According to some sources, John 12 died of a heart attack while having relations with a married woman, a death that many interpreted as divine punishment, an appropriate epilogue for a man who had destroyed his body and soul, as chronicler Liuprando of Cremona wrote. Some historians see his death as a cruel irony of fate. A man whose life was dominated by vices and the desire for power that not even death could redeem. John 12 remained an extreme example of how politics, lust, and ambition can contaminate even the most sacred of institutions, and the shame of his pontificate accompanied him until his end. Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict IX is undoubtedly one of the most controversial and scandalous figures in medieval history. Born with the name Theophylact, probably around 1012 he was read Pope in 1032, under circumstances far from canonical, making him one of the youngest popes ever. His ascent to the papal throne was largely due to the powerful clan of the Counts of Tusculum, a family that, thanks to its extraordinary political and economic influence, managed to impose one of its members without particular obstacles, thus marking the beginning of a pontificate that would shake the ecclesiastical world. Some historians of the time, like the monk Rodulfus Glaber, described his pontificate as devoid of any moral value, marked by sexual scandals and practices of corruption that further undermined the reputation of the Church. It is said that Benedict IX was not simply a man of the world, but a true example of depravity. His conduct was so immoral that even his contemporaries deemed him unworthy, and not just of the papal office. But in 1045, he made a shocking decision, namely to sell the papacy. You heard right? In that year, due to the increasing instability within the institution and his inability to govern effectively, Benedict IX, now disillusioned and unable to maintain control of power, decided to give up his papal office in exchange for a large sum of money. The compromise was made with John Gratian, a clergyman who wished to succeed him and who was elected pope under the name of Gregory VI. However, the sale of the papacy generated an unprecedented wave of outrage and controversy, calling into question the very legitimacy of the Church. But it doesn't end here. Despite his abdication, Benedict did not completely abandon the idea of being pope. In fact, in 1047, with the support of some powerful allies, he managed to retake the papal throne by force, plunging the Church once again into total chaos. This phase was characterized by political intrigues and unstable alliances, so much so that in the end, Emperor Henry III of the Holy Roman Empire was forced to intervene. In 1048, Benedict IX was definitively deposed and forced into exile, while Pope Damasus II was elected in his place. His life from that moment on remains shrouded in mystery. Some sources indicate that he would have retired to a monastery, while others suggest that he continued to plot in the shadows to try to regain his position as head of the Church. But fortunately, he never succeeded. He died on an uncertain date, probably in the years following his final deposition, leaving behind an impressive trail of scandals and disorder. The events related to Benedict IX not only left an indelible mark in the religious world, but also represented a dark chapter in history. His figure became the symbol of corruption and decay of the medieval papacy, and even today he is considered one of the most controversial pontiffs of all time. Pope Alexander VI. The Renaissance was a period of great cultural ferment, but also of countless scandals and power struggles. In this context, a figure that stood out for his audacity and controversy was Rodrigo Borgia, who ascended to the papal throne under the name of Pope Alexander VI. His rise was not the result of a spiritual calling, but rather a combination of political skills, intrigue, and corruption. Rodrigo Borgia was a man of extraordinary ambition, who saw in the papacy the perfect opportunity to consolidate his family's power and increase his influence in Italy and Europe. Cardinal Giara distinguished himself for his cunning in weaving alliances and maneuvering Vatican politics to his advantage. His election to the papal throne in 1492 was marked by one of the most corrupt conclaves in history. According to many sources, he used huge sums of money and promises of ecclesiastical positions to obtain the necessary votes, an episode that became known as the bought election. The papacy of Alexander VI was marked by a ruthless pursuit of wealth, power, and dominion, which translated into political alliances and unscrupulous betrayals. Far from being just a spiritual guide, his papal role became a means to favor his personal interests and those of his family. Alexander VI did not hesitate to use the papacy to elevate his house, making his legitimate children, Cesare and Lucrezia, figures of power in Renaissance Rome. The parties organized in the papal palaces were living legends in Rome of his time, symbols of dissoluteness and immorality that reflected in his personality. Opulent banquets, unrestrained dances, and shows of all kinds marked the rhythm of his court. The papal parties, which attracted the attention of the entire city, became known for their brazen ostentation of luxury and pleasures. An episode that has left an indelible mark in historical memory is the famous Chestnut Festival, described in the Chronicle of Johannes Burckhardt. In this festival, it is said that hundreds of courtesans performed obscene shows, and those who managed to lie with the most women during the evening were rewarded. A display of lust that reflected absolute contempt for moral conventions. His reputation as a man devoted to carnal pleasures was also fueled by his relationship with Venosa Catane, his official mistress, with whom he had numerous children. However, she was not alone. Alexander VI had several other relationships, including one with Julia Farnese, one of his most famous mistresses, whose beauty and influence extended well beyond the Vatican walls. But it was primarily through his children Cesare and Lucrezia that Alexander VI became famous for the shadows that hung over his family. Cesare Borgia, in particular, distinguished himself as a ruthless and ambitious man, symbolizing Machiavelli's prince. His rise to power was accompanied by intrigues and crimes, including the murder of his brother Giovanni, Duke of Gandia, whose mysterious homicide remains a historical enigma. Cesare used the church as a springboard to build a personal dominion in central Italy, fueling legends about his ruthless desire for power. Rumors of incest between Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, although not based on certain foundations, helped to consolidate the image of a family pervaded by violence and corruption. Furthermore, the numerous mysterious deaths surrounding the Borgia family, including those of various political rivals, fueled rumors that Alexander VI was skilled in the art of poisoning, using his medical knowledge to eliminate anyone who obstructed his plans. In the end, even he fell victim to the toxic environment he had helped to create. In 1503, Alexander VI died suddenly, probably poisoned, although some historians suggest that he was a victim of malaria. His body swelled so quickly that a rapid burial was necessary to prevent it from decomposing, a detail that helped fuel the legend of his mysterious death. In summary, Alexander VI, as his papacy, was marked by excess and intrigue. While on one hand the Pope demonstrated great political skill, on the other, his dissolute behavior and his indifference towards moral and religious principles made him one of the most despised popes in history, the emblem par excellence of the decadence and corruption of the Renaissance papacy. Pope Joan. In the heart of the Middle Ages, an incredible legend has traversed centuries of history, mixing truth, mystery, and fantasy. We're talking about a figure who has raised numerous doubts and controversies, Pope Joan. A story that, although not officially accepted by the Church, has continued to fascinate and generate discussions among historians and mystery enthusiasts. The legend, dating back to the 9th century, tells of a young woman named Joan, who disguised as a man managed to infiltrate the ranks of the male clergy, assuming the name Johannes Anglicus. She managed to quickly climb the ecclesiastical hierarchies, reaching the highest office of the church, the papacy. Under the name of Pope John VIII, the young woman, unknowing and more, found herself leading Christianity. An extraordinary feat, and if true, unique in the history of the papacy. But what makes this story even more incredible is the event that would mark her downfall. During a lavish procession, while crossing the streets of Rome, Pope Joan, now pregnant, would suddenly go into labor and give birth to a child in front of an incredulous and astonished crowd. The sudden childbirth in full public view would reveal her true identity, unmasking her true nature and destroying her papal career. According to some versions of the legend, the discovery would provoke a violent reaction from the crowd, with some accounts stating that the woman would be immediately killed, while others suggest that her papal career ended in disgrace and humiliation, forcing her to flee for her life. But how can we distinguish myth from reality? Are there historical evidences that can confirm the existence of Pope Joan? The answer, unfortunately, is uncertain. The story was primarily written by medieval chroniclers, who often relied on rumors and legends without concrete evidence. Some historians argue that the figure of Joan was a literary creation, an allegorical tale used to question the ecclesiastical authority of the time and denounce the corruption and vice of the clergy. For example, the famous chronicler Martinus Polonus, who told the story in the 13th century, never found a solid basis for his claims, but his narrative greatly fueled the legend. On the other hand, there are details that seem to lend credibility to this story. For example, the absence of any official document confirming the existence of a Pope John VIII during the period in question. This has led some historians to speculate that, in fact, Joanna may have been able to reign under a false identity, managing to conceal her true nature. In addition to this, some medieval sources refer to a mysterious papacy, in which the name of John VIII is never mentioned, but only an unknown pontiff who would have ruled for a short period is spoken of. The most intriguing hypothesis suggests that the Church, in order to protect its own image, would have deliberately eliminated every trace of this female pope. Some scholars argue that during the conclave, which was supposed to elect the successor of this enigmatic figure, the pope was immediately replaced and Joanna's face erased from the official chronicles, probably to hide a scandal that could have undermined the sanctity and authority of the papacy. In any case, most historians agree that the story of Pope Joan is an anti-papal satire, created to fuel tensions between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. This legend was based on three fears deeply rooted in medieval Catholicism: the idea of a sexually active pope, the image of a woman in a dominant position of authority, and the fear of a deception that would contaminate the very heart of the Church. What might have started as a simple satire, perhaps spread through carnivals all over Europe, ended up becoming an accepted reality, so much so that the figure of Pope Joan was also mentioned by thinkers like William of Ockham. In fact, her name appears among the pontiffs in some lists of popes. The legend then finds a certain legitimacy in the confusion generated by the use of the name John by numerous popes, including anti-popes, and by the existence of a Pope John 14 bis, but who really did exist. Because of this ambiguity, the list of bishops of Rome never includes a Pope John 20. If Pope Joan were simply an invention or a historical error, why has her legend survived for centuries? Perhaps because it touches a deep and universal desire to discover a hidden, forbidden, and forgotten side of the Church. The story of a woman who, living in a world dominated by men, manages to challenge social beliefs and reach a position of power captures our imagination and stimulates our curiosity. Thus, the figure of Pope Joan is not just a historical curiosity, but a symbol of rebellion and hidden power that continues to live in the collective imagination. The Cadaver Synod. Imagine being in Rome in the year 897 AD, a turbulent city steeped in intrigue, where politics and religion merge into a ruthless power game. The Basilica of San Giovanni in Laterano is packed with prelates, nobles, and curious onlookers. But what is about to unfold is not an ordinary council. On a throne, at the center of the assembly sits a corpse in an advanced state of decomposition, dressed in papal vestments. In front of him, a judge in pontifical robes prepares to issue a verdict on crimes that the defendant, dead for almost a year, can no longer contest. This is the story of the Cadaver Synod, one of the most macabre and surreal episodes in the history of the Church, in which Pope Formosus, already buried, was exhumed to be tried, condemned, and humiliated post-mortem. Pope Formosus was elected in 891 during a period of great political and religious instability. Indeed, the papacy was not limited to a spiritual role, but had become a powerful tool in the struggle between political factions and noble families. During his pontificate, he had to deal with the complex dynamics of medieval Europe, where the papacy and the Western Roman Empire were closely linked. Formosus sided against the Carolingian dynasty, favoring the rise of Arnulf of Carinthia as emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. This act earned him many enemies, particularly among the supporters of the Spoleto dynasty, who were trying to strengthen their influence over the papacy and central Italy. He died under mysterious circumstances in 896. Some sources suggest that he was poisoned, while others hypothesize that he was struck down by a sudden illness. But his story didn't end there. A year later, his successor, Pope Stephen VI, tied to the Spoleto, decided to take revenge on him in a way that was nothing short of cruel and unprecedented. In January 897, he ordered the exhumation of Formoso's corpse. The body, now decomposing, was dressed in papal vestments and dragged into the Basilica of San Giovanni Laterano to face a public trial. It was placed on a throne, while a deacon was tasked to represent him, a symbolic and grotesque defense for a man who could no longer speak. The charges? Violation of ecclesiastical canons, unbridled ambition, and usurpation of the papal throne. It was already written, Formoso was declared guilty. All his papal acts were annulled, his priestly orders revoked, and his body subjected to exemplary punishment. After the verdict, in fact, the corpse was stripped of its sacred garments, its 3 blessing fingers were cut off, and the body, now a shadow of what it once was dragged through the streets of Rome amidst insults and mockery. Finally, it was thrown into the Tiber as if his memory was to be erased forever. But as we know, karma often intervenes to restore balance, and such a heinous act committed by Stefano, 6 demanded divine punishment. Just a few months after ordering the trial of Formoso's corpse, his papacy plunged into chaos. The Roman people, horrified by this act of desecration, rebelled. Stephen VI was imprisoned and strangled in his cell. In the meantime, the body of Formosus, found by some monks along the banks of the Tiber, was recovered and reburied with the honors worthy of a pontiff. The Cadaver Synod remains one of the darkest and most scandalous pages in the history of the Church, a demonstration of how the thirst for revenge can push beyond the boundaries of decency and rationality, an episode that revealed the brutality of the power struggles of the time, and that still leaves the world in disbelief today. And so, after exploring together the most scandalous and dark secrets of the popes in the Middle Ages, we find ourselves facing a story that is as fascinating as it is disturbing. We have dealt with corruption, intrigues, crimes, and papal figures that in some cases seem to come out of a novel, rather than embody the image of men of faith. These popes, often protagonists of events that border on the grotesque, confront us with a question that falls within the folds of history. Have these scandals really forever changed the course of the Church? What do you think of these characters? Which of the stories I told you struck you the most and why? Let me know your opinion in a comment. If you like this episode, leave a like, subscribe to the channel on YouTube, follow it on your favorite podcast platform, or share it with your friends. Greetings and see you at the next appointment with the unexplainable.